Group 3 shifts. Group 3, you can come. Group 3, presenter. Yes, very good. Your name is Abdus.
Yeah.
You have 10 to 15 minutes to present.
Okay. So, good morning, students. Today, I'll be presenting about meanings, standards, and principles of critical thinking. And so, in my presentation, I'm going to be discussing about the definition and significance of critical thinking, what critical thinking is, and what it's used in our day-to-day activities as well as in our decisions. And I'm going to also be talking about standards and criteria for evaluating critical thinking, standards that are used in order to have an effective way of thinking critically. Then I'm going to be also talking about principles for good argumentation, principles that are used to construct a well-thought argument. I'm going to be also talking about examples and case studies demonstrating critical thinking, standards and principles, case studies that will see the usage of critical thinking, as well as real-life scenarios where the usage of critical thinking is essential, as well as the critical thinking standards and principles used in order to produce a good argument. And then finally, I'm going to be talking about the relationship between critical thinking and logical reasoning. And I'm going to be also talking about why logical reasoning is also essential for the development and foundation of critical thinking. And finally, why the avoidance of logical fallacies is important to construct an effective thinking of critically. So, the definition and significance of critical thinking. So, what is critical thinking? So, critical thinking is just simply intellectual disciplining process of actively and skillfully analyzing, conceptualizing, applying, evaluating, as well as synthesizing information that is gathered or produced from observations, evidences, reflections, reasoning, and even from basic communications. The term critical thinking implies or it involves the terms reasoning, logic, judgment, metacognition, reflection, questioning, as well as mental processes. It is a broad term that describes logical reasoning in such a way that it's open-minded and offers infinite number of solutions. And it being a discipline, an intellectual discipline, it uses and it's based upon intellectual standard values or standards that are used in order to assess and evaluate the thinking in order to think critically. And critical thinking also can be seen as two components. One, as a set of information and beliefs generating and processing skills, generating information simply, and a habit based on intellectual commitment or standards that I've already mentioned, of using those skills to guide a behavior, to just change and modify behavior for the best. And what is the importance and significance of critical thinking? So it helps to prioritize time and resources more effectively by analyzing what is essential to the process that we're using it on. And it also helps us to make informed decisions and also decide whether a decision is said to be ultimately good or bad. Because, well, the quality of our life is somewhat largely dependent on the quality of our decisions. Not only that, it has a purpose on enhancing creativity and curiosity. It helps enhancing problem solving and decision-making skills. It also helps in distinguishing facts and opinions. It also develops research skills, developing positive thinking. It also helps in the development of career as well as professions, and also helps for an effective communication. Standards and criteria for evaluating critical thinking. So, critical thinking is a disciplined thinking guided by clear intellectual standards. Standards that are used in order to assess whether a thinking is said to be known as critical or not. So, the standards that we're going to use in order to say a person is thinking critically are the clarity, accuracy, precision, relevance, consistency, logical correctness, depth, and fairness, which are some of the most crucial intellectual standards that we'll be using to describe whether a thinking is critical or not. So what do we mean by clarity? Clarity is just simply being free from ambiguity, confusion. It's just simply to remove obstacles that will make us difficult in order to understand information or a topic given. And it is also being said that if a thinking is easy to follow and understand, then that thinking is said to be known as to have clarity, or it is easy to understand and follow. The questions that focuses on clarity in thinking includes, could you elaborate that point? Can I express that point differently? Could you give me an illustration? Can you give me an example? And finally, let me state in my own words what I think you just said, and am I clear about your meaning? These are basic questions that are used in order to identify whether a thinking is said to be known as clear or has clarity. The second one is precision. Precision is just simply means exact to the necessary level of detail, or just being specific. And when something is provided in such a way that it needs the necessary level of detail in order to show someone what it means, what something means, then that way is said to be described in a very high level of precision. But there are also some situations where we don't need this level of detail and specificity. But good critical thinking often involves this level of precision. And questions that focuses on precision in thinking includes, could you give me a more detail about that? Could you be more specific? And could you specify the allegations more fully, which focuses on the precision of our thinking. Next is accuracy. Accuracy can be referred to as being free from errors, mistakes, or distortions, and it's just simply being the quality of being true or correct, even from our past knowledge in physics. It just simply defines it as the degree of being correct or true. In order for something to be said accurate, it must represent something the way it actually is, not the way that it's actually not. That's how we say some thinking is said to be known as accurate or not. And questions that focuses on accuracy in thinking includes, how could I check that it's to see if it's true? How could I verify these alleged facts? And can I trust the accuracy of the data given from the source which they come from? These are questions that are used to see the accuracy of our thinking. Then there is relevance. Relevance means bearing upon or relating to the matter in hand, or just simply implying to the close logical relationship between the topic in hand or the matter being discussed on. And in order for something to be relevant, something must focus on what is said to be, what is needed to be said. Meaning, if I'm describing something, it must describe the thing that is need to be described, not, shift our focus to other points. The questions that focuses on relevance in thinking includes, could you show me how it is relevant? Could you explain the connection between your question and the question we're addressing? How does this fact bear upon the issue? And how does this idea relate to the other ideas? And how does your question relate to the issue in hand? Next is consistency. Consistency is actually a key component, a key standard in critical thinking, as critical thinkers try to make their beliefs more consistent. If people have inconsistent beliefs, then it is said to be that one of those beliefs must be false. And there are two kinds of inconsistencies, logical inconsistency and practical inconsistency. Logical inconsistency is just saying and believing in inconsistent beliefs, whereas for practical inconsistencies, there are inconsistencies where one behaves in contradiction to what he's saying or believing. And then there's logical correctness, which is just simply engaging in a correct reasoning. And it also just simply means there is a logical relationship, a good relationship between the premise and the conclusion. That is just simply what a logical correctness means. And if the connection between different thoughts gives sense, it is also said to be that the thinking is logical. And the questions that focuses on logical correctness includes, does all this fit together? And does this really make sense? The combination between our thoughts. It can be the premise and the conclusion, or the premises with themselves. Does that follow from what I've said? And does what you say follow from the evidence? Just simply the logical relationship between the premise and the conclusion, as well as the premise and the premises itself. Is there a logical relationship? Then those then does those logical relationship make sense? And then there is depth. Depth is just simply means containing complexities and multiple interrelationship. And another thing about depth is thinking can either function on the surface of what we're trying to explain, or just probe beneath the surface, trying to go deeper into the issues of what we're trying to explain about. And questions that simply focuses on the depth in critical thinking are, is your question simple or complex? Just trying to identify the issue that is being in hand. Is it easy or difficult to understand, to answer well and truly? What makes this complex question, and how am I dealing with the complexities inherent in this question? Are the questions that are used to see whether our critical thinking is deep enough. Then there is fairness. Fairness is just simply involves seeking out open-mindedness, impartiality, as well as being free from biases and preconceptions that distorts our way of thinking. And this is actually one of the most difficult standards to achieve, but being critical thinkers, it is a basic essential skill to be fair-minded in order to be called a critical thinker. And the questions that focuses on fairness are, does a particular group have some invested interests in this issue that causes them to distort other relevant point of views? Am I sympathetically representing the viewpoints of others? Is the problem addressed in any fair manner? And is some group using concepts unfairly in order to manipulate the judges as well as the people? And are these laws justifiable and ethical? All these are just simply related to the fairness that is founded inside our thinking, whether it is fair for one individual group or fair for the group that is within that topic. Then there is evidence-based reasoning and avoidance of cognitive basis for effective critical thinking. So what is evidence-based reasoning? First of all, what is evidence in itself? It is just simply an observable sign. It is a datum or an idea of information that is relevant to deciding, or it is used to decide whether a statement or a hypothesis in the moment is true or false. We use it in order to state that hypothesis is said to be correct or not incorrect. Whereas for evidence-based reasoning is a type of reasoning that explicitly treats information as evidence in order to try and see whether an argument is said to be known as a true or false. It relies on facts rather than personal opinions, and also considers the quality and the relevance of the evidence being presented, which is very essential in enabling individuals to make informed decisions that are based upon objective facts being presented, and which is also an essential component of critical thinking when assessing the truthfulness of the hypotheses. In critical thinking, we have already said that informed decisions are very important in order to decide whether an information is said to be true or false. And therefore, in critical thinking, if our reasoning is based on evidence, then we can have informed decisions on an hypothesis or a statement. And there is also cognitive basis, which is the tendency to act in an irrational way due to our limited ability to process information objectively. And it doesn't necessarily impact us negatively, but it definitely negatively impacts our decision-making skills, how we accurately recall incidents, our critical thinking skills, as well as our relationships with other people. Mainly, we're talking about critical thinking skills, therefore, our critical thinking leading us to perpetuate misconceptions, misinformation as well, that can be harmful to others. Just simply misleads us from the topic that is being given in hand. So therefore, by avoiding this way of thinking, individuals can avoid misconceptions and misinformations, enabling individuals to analyze and interpret information more accurately, which is one of the important standards for critical thinking, accuracy. And it also allows us to improve our decision-making skills, which are also another essential component of critical thinking. Principles of good argumentation. Now, there are different kinds of arguments that we're being bombarded in our day-to-day life. So how do we evaluate those arguments? And also, how do we construct arguments that are very good in order to use them? So there are 5 principles used in order to construct a good argument. There's the structure principle, the relevance principle, the acceptability principle, as well as the rebuttal principle. So the structure principle, a necessary condition for an argument that is said to be structurally sound. In order for an argument to be said good, it must be structurally sound, and it must be formulated in such a way that there is a logical relationship between the premises as well as the premise and the conclusion. And if there is no any logical relationship to it, then the structure as a whole of an argument is said to be robust and incorrect. Therefore, questions that are used to evaluate argument whether it's well structured or not are: does the communication include at least one reason that supports the conclusion as being true? Can any of the key premises be interpreted as making of the same claim as the conclusion? And finally, do any of the premises contradict another premise as well as with the conclusion? Then there is the relevance principle. The premise just simply being relevant to the conclusion being in hand. A premise is said to be relevant if its acceptance provides some reason to believe, count in favor of, or have some bearing on truth or the merit of the conclusion. But if a premise is said to be false, or if a premise is said to be irrelevant, then its acceptance will have no bearing in it. It won't provide any enough evidence, and also will have no connection with the truth or the merit of the conclusion. The questions that are used to assess whether an argument is relevant or not is: if the premise were true, then does it make you more likely to believe that the conclusion is true? And even if the premise were true, should we be in a consideration of accepting the truth of the conclusion? Because if there is no any logical relationship, and even though the premise is true, the conclusion and the premise, if they don't have any logical relationship, then the whole argument might be false and therefore irrelevant. Then there is the acceptability principle. A premise should be acceptable to a mature and rational adult if it meets the following standards of a premise acceptability: a claim that is matter of an undisputed common knowledge, a claim that is confirmed by one's own personal experience and observation, an uncontroverted eyewitness testimony or an uncontroverted claim from a relevant authority, and a relatively minor claim that seems to be reasonable assumption in the context of an argument. That is the main points that are used to see whether our premise is acceptable or not. And the questions that are used to see whether our argument as a whole is acceptable is the premise provided one that a mature or rational adult would likely accept? What evidence is provided as a part of the claim, and does it conform to the standards of acceptability, the standards that I have previously stated, or the conditions of unacceptability? And is the premise based on unstated assumptions that a mature and rational adult will not be able to accept? Then there is sufficiency principle. This principle just simply states, are relevant and acceptable, because in an argument, the premises just simply being relevant and acceptable are not enough in order for an argument to be said good. There must also be a sufficient amount of premises, such types of premises, in order for an argument to be good. So here, there must be a sufficient number of relevant and acceptable premises of an appropriate kind and weight in order to say an argument is good enough in order for us to accept the conclusion. But in this case, it is very difficult to judge whether something, a premise in our case, is said to be sufficient and insufficient. Because, for example, in his terms, sufficient might be too large. And in his case, he might say sufficient meaning a very small amount of info. It can differ from person to person, and therefore it is very difficult to apply this principle in different kinds of arguments because it differs from one person to another person. A question used to evaluate whether an argument violates the principle of sufficiency is: are the reasons provided enough to drive the arguer's conclusion? Is the premise based on insufficient evidence or faulty casual analysis? And is some key or crucial evidence missing that must be provided in order to accept the argument? Just basically talking about whether the premise is sufficient or not. Then finally, there's the rebuttal principle. Meeting the demands of a rebuttal principle is perhaps one of the most difficult principles to apply and meet. An argument is not good in one if it does not anticipate and effectively rebut or successfully blunt the force of criticisms of an argument and the positions that it supports. Basically saying, if an argument is said to be finished if it can rebut the criticisms as well as other counter arguments that will be being provided. That is when we say an argument is said to be finished, and is said to be known as the driving force of an formation in an argument. The questions that are used to evaluate an argument if it fails to meet the rebuttal principle are: does the argument provided address the strongest counter-arguments efficiently? Counter-arguments. Does the arguer anticipate and address serious weaknesses in the argument? And does the argument show why alternative positions are flawed? Just basically trying to say, are the counter-arguments and criticisms can be finished by the argument that we're being presented? Is it enough and strong enough? Then there are examples and case studies demonstrating critical thinking standards and principles. Case studies that we're using in this case are the academic context as well as in our business decision-making context. So when we come to in our academic context, let's say in this assignment, we're given to do a paper. And in order to provide an intriguing piece of work, it is essential to apply the standards and principles of an effective critical thinking when writing a research paper assigned by your professor or a lecturer. In addition to providing all the information required, precision, the document must be written in a clear, understandable manner, clarity. In addition, the content must be relevant to the subject in hand and presented in a way that minimizes errors and mistakes, accuracy and relevance. And by applying these principles and standards, we will provide a well-written research paper with sufficient details to adequately address the assigned topic. Basically, applying the standards and the principles that we know about critical thinking, we can produce such well-made and thought paper. And in a business context, let's consider a case where a firm is faced to choose whether to invest in a marketing plan in failing sales. The marketing unit proposes a social campaign. However, the financial unit objects due to the financial restrictions. People with good critical thinking gather detailed statistics on an anticipated social media campaign costs and expected outcomes, the precision of the whole idea. They also analyze each piece of data to determine that it's only valid elements which will impact the decision. Relevance, is it relevant to the top point? Will it affect it highly in our pricings, in our financial case? And to maintain an impartial and fair judgment, critical thinkers also consider the views of other departments, being fair, or fairness in our case. A business that makes a valid decision is based upon several factors that is minimizing the possible errors. Basically, critical thinking, using these standards, we can increase our life skills. We can have a better life skills in order to manage and, be successful in our careers as well as professions. What about real life scenarios where critical thinking plays a vital role in problem solving, decision making, and evaluating complex issues? Let's say in medical diagnosis. For instance, suppose a doctor deals with a patient with symptoms that are not so clear and cannot be easily diagnosed. And in this case, the doctor needs to critically think in order to diagnose this patient. It is required from the doctor to conduct a thorough assessment of the patient's medical history, perform a systematic examinations, and evaluate other possible diagnoses and accurately and concisely interpret these results. They then must do a precise diagnosis and offer an acceptable treatment program by having in mind the critical thinking principles. It must be precise, relevant to the symptoms of the patient, as well as being fair as well to the patient, whether he's rich or not. And also applying other principles in order for the patient to be diagnosed with the proper amount of treatment. Then there is how individuals applying critical thinking standards and principles enables them to construct a convincing argument. Now here, critical thinking is an essential skill to construct and analyze arguments. Principles of standards such as the clarity, precision, and other principles that we have mentioned earlier can be used in order to produce arguments that are well constructed and can be used in our day-to-day lives. Let's say, for example, a clear argument or an argument produced with clarity is easy to comprehend and follow. People are sure that their reasoning is presented in a simple language and without vagueness. And an argument which is done with precision or precise arguments, they are specific and detailed. People write in clear and concise language when they want to communicate with their points precisely, without using too many unnecessary words or being vague. Then there's the arguments being accurate, which are based on proven facts and backed up with facts that are objective facts. Individuals carefully analyze facts, figures, and references to make their claims more truthful. And then there are relevant arguments that are relevant to the point in hand, to the point that we're trying to discuss upon. And there are also other principles we can use in our day-to-day arguments in order to make our arguments perfect, close to perfection. Then there is the relationship between critical thinking and logical reasoning. So when we talk about logical reasoning, it is just simply the process of evaluating arguments in our day-to-day lives, and determining whether those arguments are valid, invalid, they're sound or not, are their structures good enough, and so on. And the relationship between critical thinking and logical reasoning is very simple. It's just simply to analyze arguments that we use in our day-to-day lives. This process involves dividing an argument into its two parts, premise and conclusion, and seeing whether there is a logical relationship between these two points in an argument. Are they relevant to each other? Are the premises accurate enough? Are these constructed well? And are they acceptable or not? We can use those principles that we have already described earlier, and as well as use logical reasoning in order to assess the argument in hand and see whether the argument is good or not. Next is, how does logical reasoning form the foundation of critical thinking by ensuring the coherence and validity in arguments? So logical reasoning, it helps to assure that the premise and conclusion presented in our argument makes sense to each other, which is the logical correctness in our case. Not only that, it also ensures that it's clear and rational flow of thoughts, which each point being supporting the overall conclusion, and which they are one of the main intellectual standards of critical thinking as well. Because we have already said, in order for a person to think critically, its ideas as well as information must be clear and concise, as well as being presented in such a way that is relevant to the topic in hand. And logical reasoning helps us to assure this point in an argument. By grounding critical thinking in logical reasoning, individuals can develop a solid foundation for evaluating information, analyzing arguments, as well as making informed decisions, since the argument provided to us are accurate, precise, relevant, and acceptable by many individuals we have. And then finally, there is the role of logical fallacies and how recognizing them avoiding them strengthens critical thinking abilities. So we all know fallacies are just arguments with various mistakes or errors, and as well as in their structure, which weakens its credibility as well as validity of the argument. Being able to recognize these fallacies, it makes an individual assess the validity of an argument and identify whether the reasoning is flawed or not, which is also a key point in critical thinking. By understanding, being able to identify these fallacies, individuals also can protect themselves from misleading and being misled or manipulated, because that's one of the traits of logical fallacies. It misconcepts or misleads a person from the topic in hand and makes a more objective assessment on the information given. By developing the ability to identify and address logical fallacies, individuals can enhance their critical thinking skills and solve issues with great clarity and objectivity, which are also one of the great points that we have to use in order to say we're critically thinking. And finally, in order to conclude my whole presentation, I'm just going to simply say critical thinking is just an intellectual discipline skill. We all need it in order to have a better life skills, in order to enhance our creativity, our curiosity, many aspects of life. But there are standards, criteria that we need to follow in order to be said we're thinking critically. And there are also principles that we have to use in order to say we have a good argument, we have constructed a good argument, such as the structure principle, the acceptability principle, the virtual principle, and the rest as well. And critical thinking is also essential in our day-to-day lives, even in our academic context, in our business context, in a medical context. We can use them in order to have a precise and informed decisions in any case scenarios. And also by applying the standards that we know, such as clarity and precision, we can develop and construct arguments that are well thought of. And finally, by combining our logical reasoning skills as well as critical thinking skills, we can develop arguments that are very well constructed, because by using our logical skills, we can assess an argument, whether it's said to be fallacy or not, and then we can use our critical thinking skills in order for an argument that is said to be accurate or not, or also clear or not. And finally, for our references, we use these two books. We use this book in order to identify the standards and principles of critical thinking, and we also used this book in order to provide you with the principles of good argumentation. And finally, we used this book in order to show that logical fallacy has a negative impact on critical thinking, and how avoiding it will help us to have effective critical thinking skills. And thank you.
Clear and precise, to the point, even though the time is not as such. Time is not as such. We will proceed to group members. ቅዱስ መላኩ What is the main point of your assignment?
The thing that I understand from these presentations are that I understand the critical thinking meaning and the importance or significance of in our day-to-day life. Like it enhances our creativity and curiosity, and I also understand that the standards and criteria for evaluating critical thinking, like clarity, precision, accuracy, and other things. And I also understand the principles that are used to form good arguments.
Okay. What are the standards?
The standards. The first one is clarity, which means it helps us to understand clearly and easily without getting ambiguous things. And the second one is precision. And when we see what the precision, information and evidences are detailed and specific to the necessary level. And the third one is accuracy. Accuracy means being correct or free from errors and distortions. And the fourth one will be relevance. Relevance means reasoning and information arguments are connected to the conclusion. And the other one will be consistency. Consistency means they are coherent to the topic. There are two types of inconsistencies, logical and practical. Logical means when a person thinks inconsistent things or believes inconsistent things, he becomes logically inconsistent. And when a person behaves inconsistent things, we call it a practical inconsistency.
ቅዱስ ሙሉጌታ tell me what you understand from your assignment.
I understand from the assignment that the definition of critical thinking, the importance of critical thinking, the standard of critical thinking, and the principles that we use in good argumentation. There are 5 principles in good argumentation. The first one is structural principle. That means whether the premise is structurally sound. That means, as we learned before, in deductive argument, the conclusion must necessarily follow from the premise, and in inductive argument, the conclusion probably follows from. The second one is the acceptability principle. The acceptability principle means whether the premises are acceptable or not by a rational person. Relevance principle. That means, as acceptability, whether the premises are acceptable, relevance to the conclusion, to conclude. The fourth one, the sufficiency principle. That means the premises that we form or that we take are sufficient.
Let's you tell me what do you stand for? The main idea of your assignment?
The main idea of the assignment is about the meaning, standards and principles of critical argument, and examples in real life, and how can use critical thinking in our lives.
What are the standards of critical thinking?
ዘርዝራቸው ሊስት ዲማት clarities, precision, accuracy, relevance, fairness, logical correctness.
What are the type of inconsistencies?
Logical inconsistencies and practical inconsistencies.
Define them.
Logical inconsistencies are inconsistencies by the logical reasoning and evaluating the argument when we are not right with the consistency of the argument, with the premises and the conclusion. And practical inconsistencies are inconsistencies when the arguer is not right with his actions and his thinking.
What's the rebuttal principle?
Huh?
The rebuttal principle.
The rebuttal principle involves about the perspective of people into opposing arguments and
Rebuttal principle.
and this now criticism of the argument.
What are the principles of good argumentation?
Principles of good argumentation: structural principle, relevance of principle, acceptance of principle.
Tell me what is the main point, the main idea of your assignment?
I have understood that critical thinking is the ability to analyze information and making enhanced decision by questioning assumptions using logic and considering multiple perspectives.
What is the standard of critical thinking?
Standard for
Standard of critical thinking.
we have clarity, depth, fairness, accuracy, precision, logical connectivity.
What's the difference between accuracy and precision?
Accuracy is about how correct we are, and precision is how we are close to the point.
Very good. What are the principles of good argumentation?
We have structuralism, rebuttality,
What are the rebuttal principles? Good. Fair enough. كوين ملسة ملسة كوين ملسة What's the main point of your assignment? What is the main point of your assignment?
It was about the definition and the meaning of critical thinking. It gives a brief explanation about the meaning, and it gives us standards to say logical thinking. The given argument have a brief logical thinking. It gives us about 8 points for the standards, and it gives us information about the evidence and the bias, and also it gives us the criteria and principles for a good argument, around 5. And they were
Provide real-life examples that demonstrate application of critical thinking in life scenario.
especially in the courtroom, just use mostly this logical thinking, because it's not all about having the truth, it's all about explaining well. So whenever we explain in the courtroom, we need to meet those standards, like we should make it clear, precise, accurate, and it have to be sufficient to convince the judge.
What is the difference between accuracy and precision?
Accuracy is all about meeting the truth. And the precision is more often related to the repeatedness, which means our consistency to that point. And accuracy is meeting the truth.
Principle of good argumentation.
The first one is the structure. The structural principle let us to form a good argument by having by meeting the structure of the premises, and we can fully rely on the conclusion. The second one, there's also relevancy.
ክህሎት ገብረ እግዚአብሔር ክህሎት Tell me what you understand from the assignment. What's the main point of your assignment?
Our main assignment basically tells the class about critical thinking, how it's important for a person, and it lists its standards and the principles of it. The standard, there are basically 9 standards in it. There are accuracy, clarity, continuity, depth, fairness, evidence-based reasoning, relevance,
Principles of good argumentation.
there are 5 principles. The principles are structural principle, acceptability principle, relevance principle, sufficiency principle, and rebutual principles.
What's the rebutual principle?
The rebutual, it basically tells us about if an argument, it says an argument is valid if it perfectly fits if it's rebutual.
What does it mean?
If it perfectly fits the ideas it gives.
What's the difference between accuracy and precision?
The accuracy tells us if the information is true and it's free from mistakes and errors, and while precision tells us if the information is to the point, to the ideas we want. That's basically the ideas in our assignment.
Amanuel, yes. Amanuel. What do you understand from your assignment? What's the main idea?
I'm expected to only answer my understanding from assignments. Okay, our portion was to tell about the critical thinking, its standards and principles, and the way it could hold our ideas and shape our meanings in life. So when we talk about critical thinking, first, critical thinking is the way to assess information that we might hold in our lives, in day-to-day lives, and to improve our way of making reasonable judgments, to hold certain thoughts. Critical means using certain standards and principles that
The misconception associated with the word critical.
those critical.
Misconception, misunderstanding associated with the word critical.
Usually, when we understand the word critical means critical means the way we understand, we assess certain information that we might hold. We assess information that we might hold and we might counter in our life, but people certainly misconcept it as critical means way of higher, like in a sense, what can we hold it? Yeah, like when critical means like forming a certain, a truth reasoning. How can you say it? Critical thinking, like when we have a question and we form an answer to a certain question we might hold, people form it as having a certain answer that can be true or false. But critical thinking is a way to understand and our way of comprehending it. So every individual might have a different way of critical thinking, because that's a way of perceiving our information that we might hold and way of understanding it, certain reasonings. Oh, when it comes to our standards are the ways we value we assess certain information that we might hold, and these are it can be its validity. Okay, it can be its validity, its precision, as well as its clarity. It can be its relevance it can be its structure. We might form it to hold certain values. It's just standards. They are the forms. It can be the fairness. The way we reflect to our ideas and how deep the information is. I have more. Okay.
لوي بلاك
Attendance.
لوي بلاك
It mainly focuses on the meanings, the definition, the use on our daily life, and it gives like many. It gives an example of how we use critical thinking in our daily life, and shows that the principles. There are 5 principles. They are sufficiency, acceptability, relevance, and structural and rebuttal. Rebuttal, it's difficult for me to explain it, but it shows the dimension we approach the argument. It shows like the multiple direction we can approach the argument that makes it effective. Structure. Yes, the structure. I consider it to explain this. It's difficult for me to explain rebuttal.
What's the structure?
Structural principle means like the form of the argument, like it comes. Like the form has to be good in order for us to accept it and use it. It has to be a good structure.
Principles of critical thinking. Mention the
Principles. The standards. There are 9 of them. There are accuracy, precision, depth, fairness, logic, evidence-based argumentation, I think so. Fairness, depth.
Group 3, move, shift here. Group 4, group 4.
لا تفضل.